Okay. Now, good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us this morning to hear some updates on the COVID-19 and the economy in general from Dr. Robert Eiler. Rob, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Vicki. And folks, remember to use the chat functionality to ask questions as we go, and then Vicki will ask some of those questions as we can, given the time constraints at the end, but we should have some time for questions for sure. So the agenda today is to talk about jobs and recovery, and the news is getting better seemingly every day. But we're watching very closely to see, in fact, how good the news really is, in the sense that the numbers are still very new. They are noisy, but generally speaking, they are improving, and there's a bunch of different corroborating evidence that things are improving, but it's improving slowly. I'll come back to that in a minute. The big headline stuff is that for May, the US was 13.3% unemployment, which was down from the April numbers, and California was actually slightly down in unemployment from 16.4 to 16.3. But the kicker there is that's on the seasonally adjusted aspect. If you look at it non-seasonally adjusted, it's a bigger improvement, but that's why we do seasonal adjustments, even with all the other zaniness going on in the economy. It's actually more important to talk about the number of jobs lost. And since last year, a little over 3 million people have lost their job in California, if you think about how many people were employed May 2019 to May 2020. So one of the things that we need to watch very closely is, what does that mean in terms of reopening, and what are the forecasts starting to look like? And really, it's got to be about business preservation. And this is something, if you come to some of the more recent webinars that I've done, I've talked a lot, not only about job preservation, but really about business preservation. And that's one of the things about the numbers you got to be very careful about, is that if we're seeing a downturn in the numbers because there's some rehiring and some pick back up in the economy, part of that might also be that the federal stimulus that happened has supported jobs remaining in place. And if that ends in such a way that the demand is not there for those businesses to remain in business, we might see a second wave of job loss. But we will see about that. So that's one of the caveats economists are out there talking about, is that, you know, we shouldn't get too excited, but we should be at least marginally excited, which I know sounds a lot like an economist. So let's go on now and just remind everybody that this is a tale of three policies. How we're going to get out of this is monetary and fiscal policy, supporting businesses and employment coming back out of the shadows, and reducing the negative effects of the social policies we've been under since mid-March. And at the end of the day, we're hoping that we in fact see a larger effect from the two policies that are classically accommodating each other at the bottom of a recession, and that they're bigger than the negative when it's all said and done. But improvements have started. So let's look at some data. We're going to start with the US level and then drift into the California level and talk about some of the things we should be thinking about as we see policies lift. On the labor force side, or I'm sorry, on the unemployment rate side, this is what has the unemployment rate at the US level after seasonal adjustments look like since 1990. So now almost 30 years of time, 3 recessions, and technically a 4th now that was declared in May. You can see the movement of unemployment vis-a-vis the most recent 3 recessions. Generally, we peak after the recession is declared over. But what you'll see here in the far right-hand corner, which I've now outlined, is that we've seen this sort of wild movement straight north, and now it's actually come back down a little bit. And this is where the improvement, and a lot of news about improvement in jobs, has come from. Well, let's look at that a little bit more focally, just from January 2018 forward to the May data. And you can see that from 2018 forward, which is more or less true from about 2016 forward, the US economy was drifting around 4%, which is classically a number that you hear in textbook economics as full employment. Then we saw this, wild movement upward over the last couple of months, and it's come back a little bit. And then there's that improvement piece we've seen. So from an unemployment rate standpoint, things look marginally improved. If you look at weekly claims for unemployment insurance, and these are new claimants, meaning that they are asking now in this week for unemployment insurance, it has peaked and drifted down, at least in the first round. Now, historically, US recessions have had an initial peak, a drift, and then a second peak as, again, because this is going through some of the typical machinations of a recession, you see initial job losses, some reclamation, then businesses go out of business because of the sagging demand, and then there's a second round of unemployment. So we're watching very closely to see if we have the same dynamics we've seen in other recessions. But for the US, which is the left-hand axis in blue, and that's why the columns are in blue, as of 10 days ago, this is what the data look like, and you can see it drifting down from its peak. And again, these are the weekly new claimants for unemployment insurance, and this is the genesis of unemployment rates. So when these rise very quickly, the unemployment rate rises very quickly, and that's why we see these two corroborating each other. But the cool thing is the drift down is likely an idea partially that we haven't been adding as many people over the last 4 or 5 weeks to unemployment ranks as we had the previous 4 or 5. Here's California in contrast, and this uses the right-hand axis. Now, one of the things that's been funny about California is that we seem to have fallen more quickly in terms of reduction of new claimants, but then those new claimants kind of stopped falling and wobbled back up a little bit. And we'll see these data in just a second in a different way of looking at unemployment insurance and ultimately the progression of the number of unemployed people in the US and in the state of California. But we have also peaked here seemingly, at least in the first round. California goes through the same motions historically as the US. We have an initial peak of unemployment, of new claims for unemployment insurance, and then we see a second peak, which might be a light or slightly smaller. Now, what we need to watch now, and I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end, is continued claims for unemployment insurance. So these are the number of weeks that California EDD or the Department of Labor pays for when people ask for unemployment insurance. So here's the US data. And you can see we ran straight up the hill in terms of just building up the number of weeks because the number of people were climbing and they weren't getting their jobs back. So you have 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. And each month you have a maximum of, let's say, 4.5 weeks, technically depending on the number of days in the month. But the idea is how many people times the number of weeks are on the roll in terms of getting unemployment insurance. You can see that just went skyward very quickly. And you can see it's almost 25 million weeks paid at its peak and early in May. Then it drifted down and has flattened out a little bit, but it has not gone streaking down. So why did we see unemployment fall in terms of the May numbers? That V shape right there at the end of that blue line is part of it. Here's California in contrast. And as I said earlier, or just one slide ago, the new claimants for unemployment insurance drifted down and then picked back up a little bit. You can see the California data is a little bit more jagged week to week, peaked before the US peaked, but then drifted down and has now picked back up a little bit again. So one of the things that's been very concerning about California is that we saw some initial positive movement as counties in California started to rise up out of the shadows of shelter in place. But then there's been this new pickup of the number of weeks. In other words, we may have seen more people come on, as we just saw in the last slide, and more people staying on, which generally means unemployment rates are not going to fall as fast otherwise. And California typically lags the US. So none of this is actually that mysterious. It's just something we're watching. And because people are so fixated on the data are still very new. We're talking about weekly frequency, which generally tends to be very noisy. But the cool thing about these data is these are point counts. These are people, real people, not estimates, and are real weeks paid. So we're watching these, and this is actually going to become the new data if in fact we have seen the peak of new unemployment insurance. Then it's really how long people are on unemployment, which is now going to become more important. Well, on Friday, June 19, we saw the state and county level unemployment data across the US come out as an estimate for May 2020. And here is a map of the US to give you a sense of where the hotspots of unemployment are. So the more lightly colored states are where we saw lower unemployment. The darker colored states, unfortunately, including California and Nevada, are where we see more unemployment. And here are the data quickly moving down. So the US is at 13.3 on average in May. California was 16.3. Nebraska was 5.2, was the lowest unemployment in the US. So that's been a wild transformation. Part of that's because Nebraska was one of the states that opened up relatively quickly. Oregon's at 14.2, not much change from April. Washington's 15.1, again, not much change from April. And California, Oregon, and Washington are kind of walking hand in hand. Nevada is at 25.3 and is the highest unemployment in the US. In May, it was also the highest unemployment, but it was 28.2 in April. So Nevada has improved, which makes sense. And all these states are starting to show slow improvement. But for California, the improvement, at least thus far in the data, is very, very slow. We will see by what happens in June to really see if California is starting to take off. And economists generally are expecting California to have a much lower unemployment rate in June, given the small improvement in May and the nature of how many more counties are starting to open up. But the key here is that these do not include the self-employed and the part-time workers. And there's a lot of consternation in the data, and this has been true for 15 years as our economy has become much more of a mix of self-employed contractors and classic W-2 payroll employees, is how to measure these two groups well contrasted against each other. Well, one of the things is that the newspapers love unemployment rate because it's sort of one number they can stick on the front page and intends to encapsulate a lot of what's going on in labor markets. But to dig one level deeper, it's actually more important to look at the number of jobs lost or the contraction of the employment level, because you may have people that are unemployed but have left the labor force. And we're not going to count those folks as easy, which makes it a little bit more tricky. So you really want to look at the evolution of jobs. So if we look at it by industry, these are the April data, and then these are the May data for the US. And you can see that there's been some improvement, like let's say in restaurants and bars, which is, if you go to the far right-hand side, the second from the end, we've seen some pick back up in the number of jobs that were lost. And the way to read these data are the following. These data are the percentage change in the number of people working from the previous year. So the blue line is the percentage change from April 2019 to April 2020. For example, if you look at the food services and drinking places, that was about 48% change. Almost one half of the people who were working in April 2019 no longer had a job in April 2020, but in May, that's now down to only negative 36.6%. You may say, hey man, that's not that big of an improvement. Now it's still 3/8 of the people who were working in May 2020 don't have a job. And that's true, but that's way better than one half. So the idea here is we've seen improvements, but on the hotel side, which is accommodation, it's almost half the people that were working last May are not working now. And what's tricky is that almost every single state in the United States, May is really beginning to get into the heart of the tourism season, because tourism has been on major lockdown. That's a disturbing piece of data. So when you look at those job losses, there is relative improvement across the board. Some of the industries have improved a little better than others. Overall, non-farm employment has picked up a little bit. You can see at a negative 11.7% on the far left-hand side. That's better than negative 12.3, which was April. But the key is that these data are at the end of May. The New York Federal Reserve actually does a weekly forecast, which it calls a nowcast. And this is what that nowcast sees in terms of gross domestic product and really the growth of the economy as of just on Friday. So if you look at this, the second panel, if you get these slides from Chabin later, you can dig a little deeper, and the colored bars are representative of specific indicators as are shown in the right-hand panel. But what's most important for now is that these data are meant to sort of in real time with relatively high frequency data forecast where GDP is going in the current quarter. And you can see that, or you can't see, I'm going to point this out to you, that it's seeing the second quarter is negative 19.3%. And you might say, or 0.03. You might say, wow, okay, that's not that big of an improvement. But notice how deep it was earlier in May and how it slowly climbed up from June. So in this area, the Federal Reserve and a lot of economists were predicting somewhere in the low negative 30s in terms of their median forecast. And you could see that a lot of that was corroborated by this forecast. It was sort of drifting along negative 33, negative 35% for the second quarter. But because we started to lift out of the shelter in place, it's now up at negative 19, which is a stark improvement from where we were a month ago in terms of our forecast. So as I said earlier, we are improving, the forecasts are improving, and that suggests the American economy is getting going again. So folks, from an economic standpoint and the macro side, one of the biggest issues is, or the two biggest issues are depth and duration. How deep are we going to go in this recession and how long is it going to last? And a lot of the data I just showed you about the national level suggest that the duration may be slowly getting shorter every single day. And that's good. The depth is going to be relatively deep. And so the trickiness is whether or not the policies can pull us out of that depth well enough to get us, get the duration shortened and get us back toward baseline relatively soon. Well, part of it is the economics of the lift out. So one thing we're watching very closely, because we're seeing a lot of cases rise in a lot of counties and cities really wrestle with the economics of staying open. How can we sterilize places and make them safe for patrons? How can we keep people from exercising their sort of rights to be who they are while at the same time trying to remain healthy? And how realistic is it for bars and restaurants to see the full capacity? Because while you may reopen as a bar or a restaurant, if you can't gain access to the full capacity and the full demand level, it's going to be tough to remain open. What we're trying to do is if we do reclose, we don't want to reclose in general. We want to reclose in specific ways, and we're trying to minimize the economics and the economic detriment of closing again, if in fact that happens. And how can we stay open in a modified way? This is, again, a big deal for a lot of employers, especially personal services, restaurants, bars, and hotels. And that's why we've seen the job losses so deep in those categories. And what can cities and counties do in all this? And so part of it is to press for local shopping and trying to keep people consuming locally and support our local businesses. It may be that we'll see more bulk purchases and perhaps municipal grouping of purchases in a county, cities and county working together, and then spreading some of that over to your larger and medium-sized employers, especially on PPE, plastic shields, and a lot of other things we're going to need to transform our workplaces to allow safety per public health for people to come back. And ultimately is also providing some cost and time certainty in terms of resources. When you think about permitting and construction, can cities and counties become more focused on making sure that when a developer goes in and says, yes, I want to continue to build in this environment, do I have cost and time certainty? Yes, and here's how. So those are some of the things that I've been at least advising cities and counties about in terms of what they can do to support the lift out in the economics of staying open. If you look at the data, this is contrasting some of the high level data in California that just came out on Friday. The first two columns are what we saw in May in terms of the change in jobs, and there's those 3.08 million people out of work, and which is a little worse than the April numbers. In unemployment, if you don't seasonally adjust, is a little bit worse. So anyway, the point is that we've seen more people lose their job, but there's fewer people unemployed, which I know sounds weird, but if you look at the top line, which is the civilian labor force, that's why that's happening. There are more people that have left the labor force in May than there were in April. So we're watching that labor force movement very closely because that's really where we might start seeing a loss of capacity, both on the demand side and ultimately in trying to find workers as we lift back out of the shadows. To show you a similar graph to the one of the US level, here is the industrial breakdown for California. These are the May numbers and here are the April numbers. So in May, the total non-farm, which is the far left-hand side, got a little bit worse. The hotel restaurants got a little bit better. We kind of similar to the US. Other services stayed very similar. This is second to the end. Government got a little worse because now you're starting to see budgets really take hold and governments making decisions, but also people making decisions about whether or not to retire or not, which is a contraction of employment. You can leave the labor force and have an increase in the number of people, or have a further decrease in the people that are employed because people retire. So otherwise, California remained relatively stable, except construction improved, and that's a good thing. Second from the left, that smaller change from May to May means the construction projects have kept going, and we get a lot more action in the American economy and also the state economy when construction can continue. Well, part of that, or part of the questions I've been asked is what's going to happen in housing markets? So I've been watching median home prices relatively closely. In California, actually, we've seen some pickup. Here's the last two recessions, and we know the last recession was very focused on the housing market. The housing prices have not really reacted thus far. Whoops, sorry. Look at the far right-hand side. We still seem to be climbing in terms of median home price. And most of the word on the street is, at least from people who are in the industry and also just the logic of what's been going on, that lower interest rates, relatively few existing units, additional coming on market, and the slowness of construction have all kind of commingled that keeps the supply and demand relatively close to each other, which is good. Well, that's the median home price in terms of where we land after a sale. This is the listing price. And one of the things we saw, and I'm going to outline this piece here, this is really from February forward. You notice that right before this pickup in May, which is the last little kick back up northward in price, it started to slide down a little bit. And that was giving economists a little bit of consternation because they were wondering whether or not the listing price, if people were starting to put their houses up for sale and were looking for lower prices to try to attract buyers, well, that seemed to now reverse itself, at least for the time being. But again, these numbers are very noisy, and we need a few months to go by to really see whether or not lower interest rates, better consumer and business confidence, homeowner confidence, all kind of commingle to keep our prices stable in terms of our home prices. We will see. One of the things we also got as data since both the last update and also since last week is population growth in California on a calendar year basis. The Department of Finance just released their data on the January 1, 2020 population levels. And this is the change since 2010, since 2012, with the idea that these are the dates, or these are the years in which we saw changes. So you can see that the population growth has drifted down over the last few years in California, a mix of having fewer kids and also of people out migrating to other places. So the net growth in California is about 2% last year, but the key there is that the number of babies that were born are still outpacing the people that are leaving, but the difference is that a newborn baby is not a worker until they're 16 or above. Those people that are leaving generally are working families and retirees. If you look at housing units, and this is important also, this is the growth of housing units up to last year. So whether or not this trend continues for California, and this is actually a relatively slow trend, it looks like it's going relatively vertical, but if you look at the numbers on the left-hand axis, which is an index number, starting in 2010, we've only built 4.8% more units since the beginning of the decade. And my date on the very top of that should have been 2011 to 20 because it shows the changes. But the idea here is that we've only built 4.8 more percent housing in California, which means we're still going to have a housing crisis on our hands if the population of California continues to grow, but housing units are stalled because of how COVID-19 affects construction. Here's the most recent housing forecast looking 1 month forward, or 1 year forward, I'm sorry, across counties of California. And this is actually an improvement. Last month in April, looking forward to April 2021, almost every single county in California except for 2 were negative numbers 1 year forward. This time, you're seeing Zillow pick up its forecast a little bit for some counties, and you can see those on the left-hand side. California is barely positive. Some other counties are positive, most of them relatively rural, but a couple of relatively urban ones in San Diego, LA, and Sacramento. But even San Francisco, Contra Costa, which are right over the zero line orange, basically have stable prices. So this forecast corroborates the idea that we're expecting with lower interest rates and sort of building consumer and business confidence that you're going to see some housing units come on market, but you're going to see demand there to pick them up and basically lead to stable prices over the next year. And that is such a great thing, believe it or not, versus what we might have had if we have a repeat of the Great Recession. And right now, Zillow and a lot of other housing economists are also not predicting any kind of repeat of Great Recession in terms of the in terms of the housing market. So let's talk about commercial real estate, because one thing that is very tricky to look forward to and figure out is what's going to happen with commercial real estate given what we're expecting to happen with employers, what we're expecting to happen in retail. So one of the things about retail spaces, what is the future brick and mortar in our economy? Very tricky, especially those that are locally owned. And we know a lot of people who've lost their businesses, and we're watching very closely for vacancies, especially in our downtowns. Restaurants is the same deal. Who will survive? And ultimately, will the higher end restaurants, the things that can also lead to people sticking around, because your restaurants give you a full swath, or let's say a full breadth of possibilities locally. If you lose the higher end restaurants, will that keep some of your workers around? That's a real trick in, let's say, our suburban areas that have seen a rise in incomes and a rise in, let's say, demand for a broader breadth of restaurants. Office is one of the big questions going forward. Will office see a big vacancy rate, or will we see more co-working taking place as people move from the urban areas into suburban and rural areas? And there might be a complete sea change in the way office works. On the mall side, this is kind of an extension of retail and restaurants, but in a much larger footprint. If you think about our anchor tenants in malls, what are going to happen if some of those places start to have a reduction of space because the corporate entities that own those spaces or own the stores that are in those spaces walk away from those spaces because they don't expect brick and mortar to stick around? What does that do to the foot traffic in malls, and what does that do in sort of secondary and tertiary rings around those larger tenants that affect the ability of those other smaller tenants to stay in business? What do you do with those larger square footage places to keep the foot traffic going? In the industrial side, it's actually looking pretty good. We already had very low vacancy rates in industrial. If manufacturing picks up in the US, especially on the healthcare supply chain, you should expect some more action there. And that's also true for life sciences and warehousing in terms of flex R&D and some of those places where we've doing a lot of economic development. So in places where we had more of a footprint with life sciences, that's something to watch going forward as healthcare becomes more and more a focus of manufacturing, research and development, and ultimately transportation becomes a little bit larger part of our lives if in fact we do move our consumption more and more online. But commercial real estate is one of those big areas we're watching very closely as economists, because that might be where we really see a lot of major structural shifts in our economy. Okay, what are we watching? As I said earlier, continued claims for unemployment insurance is now going to become the big deal. If we feel like we peaked in terms of new claimants going on unemployment, how long people stay on unemployment is now the big deal. And then watching construction in our housing markets. Will the supply side surge because people become underconfident in remaining in their homes, or that they want to get out and profit take while the getting is good? We'll see if that holds vis-a-vis the demand side of the market. And then will we see the economy stay open? As the cases rise, and we have to expect they're going to rise, will we stay open, and will people conform to public health rules in such a way to help our economy move forward? If we see that happen, how resilient are we? If we have to kind of, let's say, specifically reclose, but not generally. But if we generally reclose, what does that mean? I mean, oh my God, can you imagine doing this again? Like we just revert back to mid-March again? That's something to watch very closely to see if, in fact, public health feels like, from a hospital standpoint or just from a general public health standpoint, we have to order a reclosure. And then what can economic development do? I talked about this earlier, but that's going to be a continued focus. If you're an economic development professional, or you work for a city or county, or you're involved in chambers, you got to be thinking about being active about local purchasing, number one, and trying to get residents to focus on buying local as much as they can. If you really want to preserve those local businesses, especially the mom and pop type of places, that's going to become more critical. So folks, again, thank you for attending, and thanks to Chabin and Kaiser Marston for supporting this. And Vicki, we'll send it back over to you now. Hopefully you are there and you're good to go.
There we go. Okay, I have one question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
Are there any movements towards finding ways to count those self-employed or the gig workers? And is there any estimate as to what % of the economy they make up?
That's an outstanding question. There are some small efforts. There are a few economic consultancies that specialize in doing, let's say, global labor market analysis and data. So you may have heard of these places, EMSI, Chmura. These consultancies specialize in trying to provide not only the so-called payroll workers, but also the self-employed. Those are all estimates, and some of it comes from tax records, some of it comes from business licenses, and it's a real wild amalgam of data sources, but there's no official data source that has been seen as the number one place to focus on the number of self-employed workers. We've seen some estimates out there that range between 6 and 10% of the economy is self-employed. But the trick in that is for example, I have a business, which is EFA, you see it here on the screen, which is self-employed, but we have payroll. We actually are an S Corp, and we have payroll. So what's tricky about that is we might be a small business that has only 2 or 3 employees, but we look like a payroll business. So there's also that sort of mixing together of those kind of businesses, and whether or not those should be counted as self-employed or counted, because they're definitely going to be counted as payroll employment. So it's maybe 6 to 10% of the employment out there, but certainly as a result of COVID-19, that's likely contracted. We do not measure it. It is a major thorn in the side of economists that we have a 2-year lag on those data officially, which is true. And that's why you see these cottage businesses sort of spring up and try to estimate that in more real time. But there is no official estimate, and we still, as a science, have not figured that one out very well.
Okay, thank you. From Paul says that in this county, not sure what county that is, they excuse me, offset restaurant lower capacity with relaxation of ordinances to allow outdoor seating. Have you seen any other counties relax rules related to the hospitality industry?
Absolutely. I mean, the general rule right now is that they're allowing outdoor, and thank God this is happening at a time where that's actually possible from a weather standpoint. But whether or not that still provides the correct support on the revenue side for restaurants to stay in business and be profitable is going to be an open question. And whether or not people are still okay with having that experience and being around other people, it's slowly emerging. And so the good thing is that the relaxing of the ordinances and allowing you to move outside provides something close to the same number of tables and maybe the same number of turns. You still need to have the combination of all those to keep a restaurant open. So that's where it's tricky for some restaurants, is that there may still not just be enough demand given the shutdown in demand previously to stay in business. And we're all hoping that our local restaurants are going to be able to survive this.
From Leslie, the federal government has spent trillions for stimulus. How does that debt or cost affect the economy in the short and the long term?
So in the short term, the nice thing about having lower interest rates, and this is sort of a classic way in which monetary and fiscal policy work together, is that the cost of new debt is small. The problem is that it increases the total carrying cost of debt the more and more debt you stack up. And that's something you have to spend money on, or the bond market will start to see you as not being able to support that debt and may start seeing a big bond sell-off. So that's one of the things the American economy has avoided, is that we still are seen as risk-free debt, and that keeps the interest rates relatively low in terms of issuing new debt. In the medium to long term, if we continue to sort of carry that debt along, at some point, it may be that the spending on on the interest payments pushes away spending on other programs, which has already happened, but does it even more completely. And that the American economy is not quite recover enough to where the global markets do not want to continue to buy American debt as much as they had previously. For the last 40 years, we have still been a place that has been a place of security financially, and the world has looked at us as a place to park its money. As long as that continues to happen, the issuance of new debt is not a terrible thing. It's just building up toward more and more risk. And as that more and more risk means higher interest rates for all of us at some point if that risk comes to fruition. And that's really the true cost, medium to long term, is destabilization of stable interest rates otherwise, because you've piled up too much debt and the world no longer wants to take that risk.
Okay. Well, it is, excuse me, 9:01, so we have a couple more questions. Rob, do you want to answer them?
Sure.
Perhaps offline, or we could answer them now, and as long as we have some people on board.
Oh, it's up to you. I can answer them offline and just put them in writing, and we can post them up as we need to, because I know people probably were now at time.
Okay, that sounds good. So check back to chavinconcepts.com, and we'll have the answers to the last few questions. Okay. Thank you again, and we will send out another email in the next week or two with the next date for the webinar. Thank you again.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.